Okay, good evening again, colleagues, and welcome to tonight's number 60 edition of the Tourism Online Forum series in the late December 2025. And we are delighted to have you joining us. And this lecture hosted by the Center for Advanced Tourism Research, CATS, at Hokkaido University. And this is your host Mo, and I will be your accompany with tonight. And it's really an honor to welcome Professor Menelaos Gkartzios, who will be sharing his recent research about researching the rural languages, knowledge, production, and the decoloniality. We look forward to learn from the insight and finding he has been exploring. So, Professor Menelaos, within the broader scholarly field of rural community development and governance, this presentation explores the challenge of knowledge production that arises in moving from the imperial research, often situated within the specific linguistic context, to international dissemination and recognition, which almost inevitable take place in English. Drawing on literature from translation and language politics, as well as the professional working experience across various linguistic and cultural contexts, for example, English, Greek, Japanese, and Turkish. This presentation discusses another politic of the rural, which is not about the discursive representations of the rural, but the natural languages and their politics that academic knowledge about the rural is produced. As such, using linguistic variations of rurality, the presentation discusses and problematizes broader concern about academic knowledge and decoloniality. So, a few housekeeping notes before we begin. And this session will be recorded and later uploaded to the CATS YouTube channel for those who wish to revisit the lecture in other language, especially with the translate subtitle with your preferred language. We also encourage you to leave your valuable question and comments in the Q&A. Also, subtitle English caption also available. If you need it, please click. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Menelaos to his lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Meng, for inviting me. It's a real honor to talk to you and your students and your community in Japan. I have actually been to Sapporo and at the university. It's such a shame I'm not there in person, but it's a real opportunity to catch up and reconnect. So maybe I'll share my slides.
Okay, please.
And we can start.
Okay, wonderful.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm just gonna move on. I hope you can see my slides and hear me all right, so I'll just kick off. So thank you very much for doing also the introduction to this talk. Just to kind of sum up what I will talk about, and also in the language of English. That's also important to kind of state maybe the obvious, but I'm sort of like interested in the politics that this obvious communication here in English creates. So I will talk about the globalization of knowledge and of research activity, and part of that is, also me talking to you today in Japan in English. But I'm also interested in power struggles that language creates. I've kind of drawn on literature originally when I was interested in this topic on linguistic imperialism and Anglophone hegemony, and I will talk a little bit about this. And I'm exploring this particular to my field, rural studies, and the term rural. And when I use the term rural, I don't use it only as a descriptive definition, suggesting, I don't know, like a particular typology of settlement or a density of population, but in a broader way, the rural as a representation, as a lay, and also a relational discourse. So I'm drawing here on my own professional experience as somebody who has traveled quite a lot, I would say, as part of my professional experience. I've held positions in Britain. I was trained in the Anglophone world in Ireland, but I've also worked in Japan at the University of Tokyo, where I spent a year and a half, and I'm currently in Turkey, where I've lived already for 3 to 4 years, and I'm also originally Greek. So I'm somebody who has been also outside the Anglophone world. So I'm gonna refer to, based on my professional experience and my research experience in this extremely diverse context and diverse linguistic context, and what this might mean for doing research in rural studies. And then I'm going to close this by thinking what decoloniality and transnational thinking might suggest in the context of knowledge production. Some papers that I draw on, I have published some of these sort of like position papers and somewhat theoretical papers based on, like, also personal experience rather than empirical papers. So if you're interested in this type of work, I've done some work in the past that has been published in Geoforum, in the Journal of Rural Studies. I'm working with some colleagues now on a paper on this, based also on a project that I was part of on a UK-Taiwan research project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, where we explored theory building across different contexts across the UK and Taiwan. So I'm sure every social scientist will agree that language construct meaning and realities. Most of us would also agree that language is not something neutral, that carries its own politics. Language creates opportunities and language creates exclusions. The idea here is to treat language not as a neutral medium of communication, not a lingua franca. It's not just a medium that we use to communicate, but something that also has and creates politics. This has been particularly reflected in the work by Robert Phillipson on I'm sorry, I just need to, on linguistic imperialism. And he particularly talks about the role of language in academia and in knowledge production as a lingua academica, trying to create emphasis on the fact that this is not just a medium of communications. Some of us has access to English language by birth. We were born in an Anglophone speaking context. Some of us had to spend years and a lot of money to learn it and still struggling with it. So language is not something that we can take for granted. And particularly in academia, language is particularly important in the context that valued and what kind of work we sort of like consider as groundbreaking or impactful usually has to be published in the language of English. But English, the argument goes, is just another language of communication. It echoes particular discourses, neoliberal and colonial discourses that can also be gender, racialized, sexualized, classed, etc. So a very nice quote here about the role of English in knowledge production by Kaplan, that not only is English the undisputed language of science, but because of the importance of the computer in the internationalization of English, the English-speaking nations might hold a virtual cartel on scientific information, because information systems are organized according to an English-based sociology of knowledge. like a very kind of powerful quotation here in relation to the privilege that the Anglophone world has in knowledge production. The other side of literature that I have been interested, and I suppose I came familiar with this by engaging and doing research with colleagues from humanities, because this isn't necessarily literature that social scientists would engage with in an intellectual and scholarly fashion. And I've sort of like realized that there's really exciting literature in translation politics. I think Dr. Meng mentioned before that some of linguist students might be attending this, which is really great. But in my fields, like in planning or in rural sociology or in rural studies, we don't necessarily thinking about the politics of translation. The basic argument here is that there is no perfect translation. But we do actually a lot of translation in our research. I have supervised so many non-Anglophone students who did empirical work outside the Anglophone world but had to translate their work in English. They had to translate original quotes, empirical material, interviews in English. So I became quite conscious about this process, that what are the skills that we have to do this? Do we teach students anything about translation? And of course, the answer is rather disappointing here that we don't, although I would argue it's a very kind of important aspect of methodology, what we translate and how we translate. And the idea again here is that translation has its politics, and the person who translates, can have quite a lot of power to alter meaning in a deliberate but also in a non-deliberate way. And this isn't an argument about not translating. The sociologist Abraham Desvan has been very clear about this, that indeed much is lost in translation, but without translation is nothing is gained at all. And I think what's really interesting here is to look at the concept of untranslatability, which again doesn't mean that certain phrases or practices or words cannot be translated, but it's about the politics that their translation entails. And I would argue that rural is such an untranslatable, not that there aren't any words, but the words that we translate to or from carry extremely different sometimes meanings. So the concept of untranslatability raises concerns about the politics of what is lost when we translate from a non-Anglophone word to an English word, how words are translated across different cultures and what meanings are transferred or lost across languages. And again, both in a deliberate way, but also non-deliberately. And I'm bringing all this sort of like thinking about the politics of language and the politics of translation to my own field, rural studies, which is a sort of like an interdisciplinary field across and in between and merging thinking and knowledge between sociology, human geography, planning, but you could also bring other perspectives in it from humanities, from architecture, from history, and other disciplines. Rural studies has been heavily influenced by British human geography, and that has been well cited in the literature because we had cutting-edge critical contributions in the field in the 1980s and in the 1990s following the cultural turn in rural studies. The invention, for example, of one of the most prolific journals in our field, the Journal of Rural Studies, is a product of that, has been a British product intellectually, let's say, led by British human geographers. And the work here that has been absolutely important and critical and scholarly amazing and has shaped my way of thinking in many ways about rural studies, internationalized English definitions and representations of the rural in a broader context. Some characteristics, examples of this scholarship, if you are interested in this type of research, has been the notion of the differentiated countryside, a thesis about power structure and differentiation across rural areas that draws specifically in Britain the discourse of the rural idyll, the imaginary of a pre-industrial rurality that shapes an academic discourse of rural representations, and it draws again in the very particular experience of industrialization in Britain. What I have here in the image on your right side, actually, I don't know if you remember this, probably not, but this is an image from the British Olympic opening ceremony, where the Brits actually created literally, they constructed, we could say, a village in the stadium as part of celebrating Britishness. Uh, and, talking about the Industrial Revolution, and it was kind of interesting to see this representation of the rural in such a big event. And again, this isn't something that you could take for granted. I'm originally Greek. Greece had the Olympics. There was nothing about the village in the Greek opening ceremony. I think also in Japan, when you had the Olympics, there was nothing about the village. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that there's something precious and important in the British narrative, in the British identity about references to the village and the sort of like the transition to an industrial society. So, all these kind of terms, I suppose my arguments here are the differentiated countryside, the rural idiom, all this kind of scholarship that we use in rural studies draws in a very, very specific and particular context with very particular social relationships and realities. And I would argue that some of these realities have nothing to do with other global realities. So Muller has argued, for example, that there is a geography to geography, in that not all knowledge in the world is created equal. But this type of knowledge created in Britain has been sort of like globalized beyond and well outside its context. So I'm going to talk about four main issues that I have observed in rural studies dealing with issues of language and translation. And I'm going to refer to my own personal experience as an academic. I had to deal with these issues in my own professional life as somebody who has been trained in the Anglophone world, but also has conducted research in Greece. And I was interested to publish this research, so I had to kind of translate a lot of empirical material from Greek to English. And I am also somebody who did spend a lot of time in Japan. As I said, I worked at the University of Tokyo as associate professor a few years ago, and I had one of the most amazing experiences and times of my life. And the picture that I have here is actually from the University of Sapporo. I don't know if you can recognize it, but it is, I think, the entomology lab, probably belonging to the School of or Faculty of Agriculture. Yeah, so I'm going to draw on four issues based on my own experience. When I was in Japan, actually, I had to deal with an extremely different language and sociology of knowing, actually, the world. I did try to learn Japanese, obviously unsuccessfully, but I did took classes before I came to Japan and throughout the time I was in Japan, and I thought that was actually really important for my embeddedness in Japan. So anyway, talking back about issues of language and translation, the first thing I wanted to say is sort of like a difference that we use in English between the agricultural and the rural. And these things refer to sort of like very different things. Agriculture referring to, production, farming, and rural referring to a broader social phenomena happening in non-metropolitan areas. What I'm saying is that there is a particular reason we're talking about agricultural economics and a very particular reason why we're talking about rural sociology or rural geography. Rural poverty, for example, is not something that referring only to farming or people who are employed or working in agriculture, but to a broader population. Um, and we've seen a sort of like a transition between the agricultural and the rural in policy making, particularly in the Anglophone world. So, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture in Britain did transition after the cultural turn to sort of like a ministry focusing on rural affairs, implicitly recognizing here that rural policy making is not just about agriculture, but it's about a lot of different things. Some of them have nothing to do with agriculture. But also, I would say this transition from the agricultural to the rural is not something that you can see across the world. In Japan, for example, you still have the MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. And in Turkey, where I am talking to you from right now, we still have a sort of like a Ministry of Agriculture, sort of like implying the positionality of agriculture and production in the sort of like rural world. And in Greek, and I presume also, I know in Japanese it's also quite complex, it is quite difficult to sort of like create an equivalence between the agricultural and the rural, and essentially because both adjectives that we use for these terms in Greek imply farming and production. So this separation between the agricultural and the rural that is sort of like taken for granted in English is not something that you can easily translate and explain in other contexts. The second is a sort of like this binary separation between the rural and the urban. And this is sort of like a dichotomy that is very important, obviously, for rural studies. We have journals such as the Journal of Rural Studies, Sociologia Ruralis, journals such as Rural Sociology. So rural is a sort of like embodies, includes a type of scholarship, and we also have journals on urban studies and on urban areas. And this separation between the rural and the urban is something that, which is an English, again, binary, is something that's very characteristic to England, and it's very characteristic to English planning. So looking, for example, post-war planning in Britain, Thomas Sharp could write that the very words town and country compromise one of the most violent antitheses in the language. There has not generally been any meeting and mingling of these two creations. There has been no grayness or twilight between them. Where one stopped, the other has begun sharply, abruptly, unequivocally. And in Britain, the invention of the post-war planning actually really played on the urban-rural binary, creating extremely different policies for rural areas and urban areas. And British planning is sort of like a characteristic of that, and a lot of different inventions, such as the garden city and green belt zones play on a strong binary between the urban and the rural. And again, I would say from looking the situation in Greece, for example, and scholarship in Greece, this binary is not relevant in the typology of settlements, but also in how we make policies about these settlements. So if you look scholarship about Greece, Greek sociologists and human geographers would argue that this separation between the city and the countryside is not so prominent, partly because of Greece's much later and slower industrialization trends. So back in the days, Zakopoulou, for example, would write that the city never competed the countryside because these urban and rural spaces were never truly disconnected, which is a very kind of different experience in Britain, where you have an urban-based working class that has no connection with the countryside at all, which would not be the case in Greece. For example, urban populations would be very much connected with the countryside through ancestry, relatives, maybe even housing, a place that they visit at the weekend for holidays, etc. So it's a very kind of sort of like more sort of like nuanced, networked experience between the city and the countryside. And I said, I suppose, that this kind of urban-rural binary is not so prominent in a context that I've done rural studies work on, like in Greece, but other binaries prevail. It's not that we don't have any binaries. And in the Greek context, the binary that I found was sort of like very interesting was this between the metropolis and sort of like the provinces. But this is sort of a very different binary, because the provinces or the places outside the metropolis are not just rural, they can also be urban. And I found this sort of like difference between the metropolis and the places beyond the metropolis being also quite powerful and very interesting in Japan. And we've written a paper also on this. And I suppose when I came to Japan, I was sort of like fascinated with the complexity of the terms that are used to imply different aspects of agriculture, rural societies based on different disciplines and based on different periods. And some of these terms would have like very sort of like neutral connotations. Some of these terms would be quite positive. Some of these terms would be quite negative, seen as discriminatory or even avoided in academic discourse. I'm not going to even try to explain to you these Japanese terms that I have here, but I'm sure you're quite familiar with. But it was just one of the ways that with Japanese colleagues of mine, I sort of like tried to understand the complexity of the rural discourse in Japan and how you translate that. And if you translate it as rural, all of the things you have lost, all this kind of difference between Mura, Shuraku, and Buraku that is implied and taken for granted to a Japanese person is sort of like lost if you just use rural. The third thing that I wanted to talk is this idea of the rural as an identity and essentially a class identity. This has been really, really important in academic scholarship and particularly after the cultural turn in rural studies. This has shaped the academic discourse, especially discussing phenomena such as rural restructuring, counter-urbanization, and gentrification, where the rural is not just a place where the middle class moves to, where the urban middle class moves to. It is actually a space of class formation. So this is something very, very specific and intellectually very sort of like interesting and powerful, but it's something really almost uncomfortable to use when you're talking about other contexts where the middle class has nothing to do with rural spaces. And I've experienced that in spaces in Greece, also spaces in Turkey. So associations of the rural with a class identity are are leading to sort of like misconceptions, misinterpretations, and confusion. Um, the fourth thing is a separation of how academics talk about the rural and how people who live in the rural talk about the rural identity. And there's also a separation here. And I sort of like came across this problem when there was a translation of a very prolific book by a British scholar. If you're doing rural studies, this is one of the kind of best books in the field by Mike Wood's Rural Geography. Mike Wood's Rural Geography has been translated in Greek, but they couldn't really use the translation of the term rural because it would just refer, it could be translated, let's say, to agricultural geography or farming geography. And then all the interesting things that are covered in rural geography would be lost because rural geography is not just about agricultural production or about farming. It's about globalization. It's about power structure. It's about inequalities in the countryside. So the Greek translation here, they used sort of like a very different term in Greek that could translate as something like geography of the landscape or of the provinces. And that's also fine because they try to go away the problem of the rural agriculture. But it is also a problem because it's a term that people who live in the countryside don't use. And it's not a term that is used to describe people's identities. So I think this creates a lot of complications on what kind of terms we use to discuss the populations we're working with. And to some extent, these terms should be owned by the community. So in the paper that I've written about this, I'm really advocating for using terms even in the original, the indigenous languages. So if you're if you're doing a paper in Japanese, use the Japanese term to imply this identity and explain it. Don't just say rural, because a lot of the things will be missed. So these are four complications that I sort of like became aware in my own, let's say, traveling in different linguistic contexts and doing research in rural studies. The final part of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about decoloniality and knowledge production, because this has also been very sort of like powerful and important, and we're trying to decolonize also academic knowledge. We're in a period of understanding now and accepting the dominance of Anglo-Eurocentric and white frameworks in the production of knowledge. And the colonial ambitions, efforts, praxis is about embracing non-Western and indigenous perspectives. And indeed, there's been so much exciting and amazing work on the colonial rurals. And Muller has written a fantastic paper in Progress in Human Geography about the positionality of language in this kind of the colonial debate, arguing the absence of debate with regards to language and linguistic privilege in human geography. So, taking his arguments, he would write that where the calls for the colonial agenda have been heard and cited, scholars have written in or at least be translated into English, not in any other, not in Greek, Turkish, Japanese, or Albanian or any other languages. So he would argue that the colonial project therefore faces a paradox. Its articulation in English risks perpetuating the very hierarchies it seeks to subvert. So, and that's a very kind of difficult issue to go through, to to resolve, let's say. But I think we have to talk quite a lot about the coloniality and knowledge production. And for somebody like me, for example, the coloniality is not just another theoretical framework. The coloniality is praxis. is, doing a sabbatical in Japan and trying to learn Japanese, or doing it in Albania and trying to learn Albanian and engaging with that. And I suppose what I wanted to say is that there's also a sort of like there are other paradoxes with decoloniality. Myself, I'm uncomfortable sometimes talking about decoloniality in working with Japanese, Greek, and Turkish languages, because all these contexts have colonial and imperial legacies. And if you take Japan, for example, is undeniable until recently. One of the biggest, the second biggest economies in the world, imperial heritage. But in terms of knowledge production, really sort of like mirroring Western discourses. And there's a very nice paper by Takayama who wrote that while Japan is a global north, Western capitalist context, its scholarly communities rely heavily on European and North American academic institutions for intellectual insights, directions, and theoretical knowledge development. And, these type of asymmetries also exist in Greek and also in Turkish. So I think we have to talk about, the colonial ambition or the colonial project, and sort of like appreciate asymmetries beyond colonial histories, beyond sort of like a simple narrative between colonizers and colonized people. Like it's much more messy, and it's complex. So the last thing here is how to think and act transnationally. And by transnational here, we sort of like imply this sort of like the colonial mission to sort of like analyze and understand contemporary rural society that is not biased in any particular context. And usually, that's the Anglophone context. It's the US, it's Britain, it's Australia. If you look at the first handbook in rural studies published ever, literally most contributions were from the Anglophone world. But, we have to remain open to contributions and influences in diverse geographical settings. So how to do this has been one of the questions I've been trying to explore. I think talking about this openly and even sometimes uncomfortably is part of dealing with this. So I think we do need to appreciate language politics in knowledge construction. That might be about using indigenous specialities and identities to discuss the rural in original language, embracing language vitality. Like, we don't treat language here as something that is static and has remained like that, but something that always changing. We might need to make up new terms. Like, language is something that always evolves. I think it's also about appreciating that meaning is more important than grammar, especially when you're talking about somebody else's cultural grammar. So grammatical errors in some cases might be even appropriate because they signal paradoxes, because they signal things that you have to explain. That this error in grammar actually is not an error in the spatiality or in the identity that you are discussing. In the particular project that we dealt with colleagues from Taiwan, we also sort of like unpacked and understood the different meanings that particular words and practices carry between the Taiwanese context and the British context. So we talked about differences in representations of land, agriculture, the importance of public, private, and its difference in Taiwanese society and in Chinese society. And I think that's also the case also in Japanese. Things such as the importance of Guangxi relationships, their meanings for rural societies, meanings of the good farmer, who is a good farmer, and even the term the good farmer, how something that's so dominant in Anglophone literature means very little if you take it outside Britain and map it onto Taiwan. The second thing is about developing a reflexive positionality as a group. And the argument here is, to do a decolonial project or to do a project with a decolonial ambition or insight, you have to be transparent about who you are, where we come from. These things matter. So we need to acknowledge linguistic privilege in knowledge production. Usually these type of privileges are associated with how we interpret academic terms around the rural and particular scholarship. And what we found that it's not so much about developing a sort of like a framework to do this sort of like praxis of developing a reflexive positionality. There's a lot of things like that in the literature, but it was literally about being open about, your engagement with the countryside, as a scholar, where you come from, etc., and talking about this through open dialogue. There are some ideas about this, how to embrace a reflexive positionality, but I don't want to tell you too much about this. So, and this is my last slide to sum up. I suppose I started talking this seminar about the politics of translation, acknowledging there is no perfect translation. But then we have to think seriously about how we do it, because a lot of us do it in our PhDs and professionally when we work in contexts outside the Anglophone world, but we are required to publish it in English. We do a lot of translation. So how do we do it? With what skills? What training? And is AI the solution to all this? Or can this create even more problems? There's some fascinating work coming on sort of like biases in terms of if you ask, for example, AI programs to sort of like show you images of the rural idyll, uh, a lot of them typify a British rural idyll, which might have nothing to do with Japan or Greece or Turkey. So this is very important for the pedagogy and like how do we teach students who do a PhD how to translate and the politics of translation. And I think it's very important for epistemology in terms of how do we do this in terms of the methods that we use in broader social science research. I'm not here to argue against global knowledge, obviously, but I mean, I come from a field of studies that is very much attached to places, to locality, and we sort of like have to value it and to understand that in many cases, rural studies scholarship is particularly local, and a lot of the things cannot be translated without any politics or without any problems. Finally, I do believe the coloniality is sort of like, I did say that it's not just like, a theoretical framework. The coloniality is also personal. I can tell you a lot of experience. So when I moved to the University of Tokyo, I did try to learn Japanese, and I had tried already to learn Japanese before I moved to Japan, which caused a lot of amusement. And to my Japanese colleagues, many of them thought that this is a waste of time, and they were surprised because nobody else before had tried to do this. I also engaged in Japan with many expats, as we call them, foreigners, who had no Japanese at all. And I just think that, I do think this is problematic. Obviously, I did not learn Japanese, but the value is in trying and in what kind of access this gave me to Japanese society. So it wasn't about learning Japanese, it was about engaging with this particular discourse in a sort of like honest way that was valued and appreciated. And I did feel it in my experience in Japan. And I got the first, but just the first, very simple degree in Japanese learning. So I think we need to expose ourselves, become uncomfortable, worldling ourselves to polyglot learning. And obviously, this isn't particularly valued in academia, but it would be great also to have a system that sort of like really values it and appreciates it, because I think the coloniality is personal and in many cases is a choice. Okay, so this is me. What I think I should be doing is finish my slides and stop sharing and picking up any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Menelaos Sensei. So let's welcome more question comments. Either you can raise up your hand, talk live, you can also leave your message. Okay, anybody? So if no question coming, I will kind of like the man. Wait. Simona, Simona, please go ahead. I will allow you to talk. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Quickly.
Okay, so this is Simona Menelaos. You might remember me. Hello.
Of
So
course, I remember you. Hi, it's lovely to hear from you.
it was really interesting. Thank you very much. And I feel like your lecture really spoke to my experience as an Italian person who moved to Japan to do her PhD, and I was doing research about Italy and Japan in English. So, I mean, publishing in English. So I often encounter this sense of disconnection between the experience of rurality in Japan and in Italy, and then having to somehow translate that experience into English, but not just English language, but also English scholarship. And I do feel, I guess, I would like to ask you first, like, what's your experience with the kind of academic world, especially when publishing? Because my experience, especially when I was beginning, was that there was a lot of resistance or kind of sense of that the scholarship coming out about, let's say, rural areas that were not maybe Europe was less universal and less important than the scholarship about rural areas coming out of Europe, but especially Western Europe and especially maybe the UK and so on. So, for example, when I published my first paper about Japan on Sociologia Ruralis, like I had to do so much work in explaining everything about how rural areas work in Japan, and because again, it was difficult to even that the reviewers were not kind of they were quite skeptical about, okay, how does this experience of rurality in Japan translate into, something that is universal and that can create some kind of universal theory. So I would like to kind of hear your experience about, again, the publishing aspect, and has it gotten better? Are there journals that are better or worse at doing this? And how that is the landscape changing in academia as well, maybe? I hope that the question is somehow clear.
The question is totally clear, and it's a fantastic question because you bring it into sort of like a broader politic around our careers. And thank you so much for bringing that, Simona. I mean, also how fascinating, like I'd say you are my case study. I want to write a paper about your experience as an Italian, comparing Japanese and Italian ruralities and trying to publish this in English. Like I can just imagine the difficulties and the complications that you had to deal in terms of empirical research, in terms of translation, and then in terms of convincing the reviewers or the editors that this is important. I agree with you. Like I have experienced similar things. I'm somebody who did my PhD in Ireland. That's Anglophone. But in many cases, I had to sort of like justify that the Irish case is sort of valid or interesting internationally, which is something I never really understood. Why are some places more interesting internationally than others? Like, I just never got it. I suppose what I'm trying to say is I completely understand um, how difficult that has been and the frustration. And I'd say you were talking about the frustrations that many of us have experienced, particularly when you try to publish from a context that there hasn't been a lot of literature. To say about Japan, when I was doing my PhD, and the Journal of Rural Studies was the best journal in that type of field, there were like 2 articles published about Japan only. So, like to bring suddenly, like you wouldn't even know who to cite when you were doing this type of work, sort of like internationally, to convince that there's some sort of like currency in the type of work you do. So it has been unequal, it hasn't been easy, and this doesn't mean also there hasn't been excellent work about rural studies in Japan, but it has never been in the Journal of Rural Studies where we consider it as the place to look at excellent work. That's the politic. Uh, Not that there hasn't been fantastic work in Japan. It's just like the world hasn't been access to it because of the language politic. So it's uneven, it's difficult, it's uncomfortable, it's frustrating. Has it gone better? I do think it has gotten better. So there is, the last 10, 15 years, a really like sort of like a globalization of knowledge that you would find much more papers about particular contexts in more sort of like established journals. It doesn't mean that they had it easy, but I think it has gotten better. And also that the colonial project, even as an ambition, how to do it in practice is extremely difficult and painful. But even as an ambition, puts pressure on editors, on reviewers to consider contexts, knowledge, practices outside what they know. The problem is that, they're still going to assess it and review it with their own glasses, which might have not been very much exposed to the world. That's why I think we need to world ourselves, expose ourselves to the world. So I do think it has gotten better. It hasn't been easy. Um, and maybe, yeah, it hasn't been equally better for all of us. So, maybe, Japan has some kind of currency, it's sort of like global north. Some of the top universities of the world are Japanese. I can give you context that they're still struggling to put work out there. So yeah, I'm like cautiously positive that it has gotten better, but not for everybody and not without painful complications and fights. Like look who the editors are, or look who the reviewers are. Like in most cases, these are, people from very specific contexts.
Okay, thank you very much.
Simone, if you want to add anything, I'm very happy to hear your experiences.
No, I mean, I actually, I mean, you have more experience in this field than me, but I also have this feeling that is somehow getting slowly better. But again, the editors, a lot of reviewers, again, still see things from a very narrow somehow perspective, so that still kind of holds people back. But I do think and I hope it's getting better. And I wonder to what extent maybe the fact that now China has become a quite prominent, like presence, like Chinese scholars have become quite prominent in like rural sociology and rural studies. Maybe that's also somehow contributing to changes. I don't know to what extent, but I do see a lot of papers by Chinese scholars nowadays, which is
True.
kind of, and maybe you have
True.
experience in working in China, so maybe you have some ideas about this.
That's actually an interesting point, and it is true actually, and the proliferation also of Chinese work in this sort of like more Western journals, let's say, is quite phenomenal. Uh, yeah, and in terms of also of positions of power from a knowledge perspective, like you would have a lot of kind of Chinese editors now, you would have also a lot of people from China in editorial boards, and I think you would also have really, really good work. And I'm saying this because sometimes, there's a sort of like a bias towards what constitutes good work. I see excellent work emerging from China in the type of journals that I'm studying. Uh, yeah, it is positive. It has changed, but it's a very kind of singular experience, and it has to do also with the fact, I imagine that all the learning of English in Chinese academia. By that, what I mean is that, I lived in Japan. I worked at the country's premier institution. Many people could not speak any English at all. This doesn't make them not good academics, but it has an impact on whether they will produce work that is accessible to the world. And I also see that also in Turkey, where, in the society, not many people speak English. Like you really need to learn Turkish. It's not like it's survivor skill. Like living in the Netherlands is not the same like living in Turkey or Japan. You need to engage with the discourse, with the language. I think, and I don't know why, like Chinese academics have been quite globalized in the way that they publish a lot of work in English. And yeah, it's sort of like it's good. I just think we need some kind of more balance. Like, we don't want to replace a dominant scholarship, let's say by US and the UK, by another dominant context. I want to see journals and editorial boards and work that is plural. I think this is what I'm sort of like advocating for. I applaud Chinese scholarship, and I think it's really good, particularly excellent scholars in rural studies. But I will not be comfortable unless I see really good work also from Uzbekistan, from Albania, from, African countries. I want more diversity. That's what I'm sort of like arguing for.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Do you have other question?
Can I have just a quick follow-up? Because
Okay.
I find this actually, I completely agree with what Menelaos just said about kind of, it feels like there's sort of being a slow replacing, or at least kind of a dominant kind of language and culture with maybe another one, because there's so many Chinese scholars or Chinese-based literature now, but not a lot of other countries. And I wonder, so I'm kind of you kind of briefly mentioned AI at the end as a raising question, how can AI potentially help or not help in these kind of things? And maybe, so I'm on the fence about AI and how useful it's actually is or is going to be, but I think this is maybe the one area where it can help, because again, I guess AI, I've tried, so I've been doing a lot of trial and error, trying to see how good AI translation is, for example, of Japanese into English or Italian into English. And since somehow I can speak these languages or I can understand these languages, although I'm not, for example, Japanese is not my first language, but I can somehow evaluate the quality of the translation. And I'm thinking that that's one way in which AI can help kind of even the playing field, because maybe scholars who are not that strong, I mean, who have strong research skills, but maybe their language skills into like in writing in English is not as good, then AI can help them in doing that. So I've been thinking about that in terms of like making the playing field a little bit more equal for researchers in countries where people might not have such strong English skills or strong push towards internationalization. Yeah, that was the comment. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from the Q&A box. So what is your opinion about the strong attempts to adapt rural area to the urban system? For example, this is the transition kind of question. Considering distinction between rural and agriculture spaces, that's the question. I don't know if it's clear enough.
Uh, Mo, could you just repeat? It just
Okay.
paused for 1 second. I'm
Yeah, so
sorry.
what's the
I
opinion?
didn't hear the.
Yeah, about the strong attempt to adapt rural area to the urban system. So considering the distinction between rural and agriculture spaces. Mm,
Okay, so that's like a broader question about the field itself, or sort of like what kind of policies we make for
mm,
rural areas. Um, it's a very difficult question to answer with sort of like a magic response.
mm,
Um, Part of the response that I want to give is to acknowledge that transformation is inevitable.
mm,
So, whether this transformation is viewed as urbanizing the countryside or,
mm,
I don't know, globalizing the countryside, uh, is up for a question. But I wouldn't be in favor of a sort of like a policy that tries to keep the rural area in a sort of like a magic glass that we sort of like see it and we preserve it as it is. Transformations will always happen. I just
mm,
don't necessarily agree that these transformations are urbanizing the countryside. And
mm,
like if I draw a little bit on the criticism of planetary urbanization, we can also see how the city is becoming more ruralized as well.
mm,
So, I mean, I would like to ask the person who asked this question, what do they mean by urbanizing the countryside? Is it like, do we build more housing, for example? And is this like an
mm,
urban indicator of the countryside? I would say no. I would say we need more housing in the countryside, so more people live in the countryside.
mhm. Yes.
And good housing in the countryside. I wouldn't see this as something that urbanizes the countryside necessarily. I want policies that they create, opportunities for people to live in these settlements and allow change.
Mm,
How we talk about these spaces in a relative way, urban and rural, is sort of like just an invention. Like,
mm,
it depends what this person who asked this lovely and intellectually loaded question
mm,
mean. Yeah, so I don't think we should preserve the countryside in a way that to keep it as we think the countryside should be. I think we need policy to allow the countryside to diversify, to change. For some, this might mean that the countryside is urbanizing, but for others, it might also mean that the city is becoming more rural.
mm.
It's
Right.
relative.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is the best answer I can give, I
Yeah, yeah,
think.
yeah. Thank you. I totally agree. The changes are often inevitable, right? So that's connect to a follow-up question from me. So we see people in some research start to use a word like a Ruben. It's a combined urban and rural. Also, some people use urban rural. So it's become also more popular want to demonstrate the relationship. So, what's your opinion about this? Of course, before we divide rural and urban like a contradictionary, then we realize like Wood says, rural means everywhere else, in compare with the
Yes.
urban. Yeah, what's the future trend? How can we think about this development? We put them at the set, or there is other possibility we think about the rural-urban relationship.
Uh, I mean, I don't think the binary is helpful in any
Hmm.
way.
Mm,
The urban-rural binary, I mean, and I don't think it's representative of the reality of our experiences across these
mm,
spaces, which is much more dynamic, it's fluid, it's both. you
Mm,
know. There have been many attempts over the years, and even scholarship from the 60s they were talking even back then on the urban-rural continuum, and there have been a lot of sort of like works to imply how these two specialities coexist in particular
mm,
spaces. Um, Yes, I'm favor of it. I'm favor of new terms. Some of them will stay. Some of them, have a very short
mm,
life. The truth is that in some context, even the truth is that we're still sort of like conditioned to think of our spatial experience
mm,
across these two binaries, which we also understand are not reflective of the reality. If we were
mm,
to find new ways to replace the binary, I'm up for it. But I want to be careful not to erase the
mm.
rural experience.
I see.
The, whatever that is.
Mm.
That is the problem because the urban and rural are opposite, but they're not equally opposite.
Right, right.
So
That's very important.
if you take one out of the equation,
Mm,
the urban can take over, and
mm.
that's the problem.
All right.
So yeah, throw more terms in the debate, but some of them I would imagine will be short-lived, and yeah,
Mm.
that's part of our intellectual process in understanding these specialities.
Yeah. So,
I
thank
don't
you.
know. What
Mm.
what do you think? Do you agree or do you find this?
I think it depends on the context. Yeah, that's
Mm,
later I will introduce some book about the Japanese context. But before I want to ask our audience, do we have any extra thought? Because we have a Japanese scholar, we also have a overseas scholar. Also, we have I think Professor Longfei from Guangdong Ocean University. Maybe can talk about China experience if you want. I mean, since we have a lot of rising publication from China, if you know anything about this, well, welcome to share. I mean, yeah. If anybody have any question, please raise your hand or leave your question above. Hmm. So before, if no, and then I would like to talk about this book. It's not an academic book, but it's Inaka. Inaka means rural, right? It's bound down by one of our friend, also Simona knows her, Amy Chavez. And at the first chapter, she gave a definition of Inaka, the rural, the countryside, and the sticks.
mm,
Yeah, basically in this book, I think how Japanese context in English publication try to define, sorry, they try to really draw a geographic location from Hokkaido, the mountain area in Japan, also the island community in the Southern Sea until Okinawa. So it's really diversified range of a geographic set. I think that's basically means the everywhere else, right? Except Tokyo
sure.
and Osaka. Yeah.
And can I say something more on this?
Yes, please.
Inaka is very interesting in the Japanese context
Mm,
because academics avoid it, but it's also
mm,
very common in sort of like lay discourse, or it's
mm,
shifting and becoming a little bit more common, and there's like evidence of sort of like more kind of because inaka can be derogative, can be sort of like teasing, a
mm,
term of ridicule, but it can also be a term of pride, especially if you're from Inaka.
mm. Right. Yeah,
But
that's
it's not,
mm,
but you don't see it as Inaka sociology or something. Whereas
right.
Inaka probably is a very kind of important
Mm,
term
mm,
for people living in those places. And Inaka is interesting because I think it sort of erases the urban-rural binary. Because
mm,
there's Inaka, which is, if I understand these terms correctly from my Japanese experience, which is, superficial in the
mm,
in the whole grand scheme of things.
mm.
Um, Inaka is out there, but out there can also be a town, a city, or a village. It's not
Right.
necessarily rural. Huh?
Mm. Right.
It's distant, it's far, it's
Mm.
it's not Tokyo,
Mm.
Kyoto, Osaka type of thing, but it can also be
Mm.
urban in somebody's experience. And I think that's kind of
That's true.
fascinating.
Yeah.
So to go back to your previous question, maybe we don't need new terms. We need to appreciate
Yeah.
old terms and
Right.
we need
Right.
to engage with them in a
Mm.
scholarly fashion. So how do you
Mm.
translate Inaka? And why not use Inaka in a formal way of talking about their rural identity? Don't
Mm.
translate it. Say the Inaka identity and explain what that means in the
Yeah.
context.
Yeah. 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 In the context, I like that. Okay, actually, I think one more thing in my mind because in China context, we often have a joke because for Shanghai, for people from Shanghai, everywhere else is Inaka, is rural. Yeah. So,
Exactly.
right? Mm,
Exactly. So it's also and that's the same also in Greek way of separating the metropolis from the rest. Like the rest is not just rural; it can be
mm,
also urban, but still it's parochial urban.
mm,
It's
right.
it's yeah, it's the same.
Mm.
It's another binary, really.
Yes. Okay. Do we have any other question? If not, I think we can close today's session. And I want to thank you again for your wonderful lecture and also your thoughts about rural. And also thanks our audience. Also, Professor Simona asked valuable questions. Okay, so I think we already occupied you more than an hour, so let's allow you to start your wonderful day from another part. Oh, wait, one more question. Sorry, the last question then. Okay, just a comment from Merve Baska. Maybe you know.
Oh,
The-
Başak, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you
Oh,
very much.
some Turkish colleagues of mine.
Okay.
Merhabalar.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank
thank
you
you for the
everybody
time.
for joining us tonight. And we will be happy to see you again in some different occasion or
I
to
really look forward to it.
yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And also from Simona as well. Okay.
Thank you so much.